But this Monday was different. The phone at the Restorative Health and Healing Center kept ringing, the calls bouncing between receptionists. Patients were waiting. Dr. Teresa Sievers was never late. She was the kind of doctor who remembered every patient's name, the one who stayed late to make sure no one left without feeling heard. Yet she hadn't shown up. She wasn't answering her phone. It was uncharacteristic, unsettling. At first, her staff assumed she had been delayed. Perhaps her flight had been postponed. Or maybe she was simply catching up on rest after returning home late from a weekend trip. Teresa had flown back alone while her husband, Mark, and their two daughters remained on vacation. She had been expected at the clinic first thing in the morning. By mid-morning, a sense of unease crept through the office. Calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail. Mark Sievers hadn't heard from her either. At least that's what he told them. Finally, Dr. Sievers' close friend and assistant, worried sick, decided to drive to her home in Bonita Springs, a quiet upscale community in southwest Florida where crime was nearly unheard of. The small house, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, looked undisturbed from the outside. The driveway was empty. Nothing seemed amiss. But when she knocked, there was no response. The door was unlocked. Something felt wrong. Stepping inside, she immediately sensed the heavy silence. The air was thick and unmoving, like the house had been frozen in time. She called out for Teresa. Nothing. And then she saw it. The kitchen. The blood. The horror. Lying on the tile floor was Dr. Teresa Sievers, motionless, her body twisted unnaturally. Her head was unrecognizable, bludgeoned beyond recognition. Blood had splattered across the cabinets, streaked down the walls, pooling onto the cold white tiles beneath her. The scene was brutal, almost surreal. The woman let out a scream that echoed through the empty house, her voice cracking with pure terror as she stumbled backward, fumbling for her phone. Within minutes, the 911 call was made. The Lee County Sheriff's Office responded quickly. First responders rushed in, securing the scene, taping off the perimeter. The seasoned officers who had seen their fair share of violent crimes knew one thing for certain. This was not a robbery gone wrong. There was no sign of forced entry. No valuables were missing. The house was too clean, too precise. And the way Teresa was killed? It was personal. The brutality suggested rage. Someone had wanted her dead. Not just dead, but obliterated. This wasn't a crime of impulse. This was execution. Detectives quickly established the timeline. Teresa had returned home alone on Sunday night, landing in Fort Myers after a short flight. She had driven home, sent a few text messages, and then nothing. Sometime between that night and early morning, she had been murdered. Investigators turned their attention to the people closest to her. Who would want Teresa dead, and why? Her husband, Mark Sievers, still out of town with their daughters, was contacted immediately. His reaction over the phone was one of devastation, his voice breaking, gasping for air as he processed the news. But something about the crime scene didn't sit right with investigators. There was no sign of a struggle, no desperate attempt by Teresa to fight back. It was as if she had let her killer in. Had she known them? Detectives had one crucial question. If this wasn't a random attack, then who had orchestrated this brutal murder? And why? The crime scene was unlike anything the investigators had encountered before in this quiet suburban neighborhood. The moment they stepped inside, they knew this was no ordinary homicide. Dr. Teresa Sievers had been murdered with calculated brutality, and yet nothing had been stolen. The scene was too neat, too staged. Whoever did this wanted her dead, and they wanted it to be personal. Detectives moved methodically through the house, scanning every inch for clues. The kitchen was a horrific display of violence. The floor stained with blood, the cabinets streaked with evidence of a savage attack. A heavy-duty claw hammer, its handle barely visible beneath the gore, lay discarded near the body. It was clear that this had been the murder weapon. Teresa's injuries told the story. She had been bludgeoned repeatedly, struck with force strong enough to fracture her skull multiple times. This was overkill. A single blow could have incapacitated her, yet the attacker had continued, ensuring there was no chance of survival. This kind of rage, it wasn't random. The investigators noted what wasn't present in the crime scene just as much as what was. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle beyond the area where she fell. The house was otherwise undisturbed. Whoever had done this either had a key or was let in willingly. Teresa Sievers had known her killer. The first priority for detectives was establishing a timeline. Sunday evening, Teresa had flown back from Connecticut, where she had been visiting family. She had driven straight home from the airport and sent a few text messages. By all indications, she had walked into her house alone and had not left again. Her phone records showed no distress calls. There were no signs of an intruder forcing their way in. Everything pointed to the attack happening shortly after she arrived home. But then there was the strange detail of the unlocked door. If this had been a calculated attack, would the killer have left the door ajar? It was possible. Maybe they had staged it that way to confuse investigators, to make it seem like a random break-in. Or maybe, just maybe, the killer had been so confident, so sure they wouldn't be caught, that they hadn't even bothered to hide their tracks. The medical examiner arrived to transport the body, carefully working around the forensic team, who were collecting samples from every surface. The floor beneath Teresa's body was swabbed, her fingernails scraped for any trace of DNA. If she had fought back, even for a second, she might have left a clue behind. And then came the first red flag. Detectives checked the home's security system, or rather, the lack of it. Teresa and Mark Sievers had security cameras installed. But when investigators checked the system, it had been deactivated. Someone had manually turned it off. Who would have done that, and why? The next step was talking to Teresa's husband, Mark Sievers. Mark had been out of town at the time of the murder. He and their two daughters had remained in Connecticut, visiting family. His alibi was solid. He had receipts, flight records, and multiple witnesses to confirm he had been hundreds of miles away. When detectives called Mark to inform him of his wife's murder, his reaction was immediate and dramatic. His voice cracked. He sobbed over the phone, demanding to know what had happened. By all accounts, he sounded like a devastated husband. Yet something didn't sit right with investigators. As they continued speaking with him, they noticed his responses felt rehearsed, like he was performing grief rather than experiencing it. His voice trembled, but his words were measured. Then came the strangest part. Before investigators had even provided him details, Mark blurted out, "She was murdered, wasn't she?" It was a small slip, but it sent a ripple of doubt through the investigation team. How had he known? The friend who found Teresa's body had only reported that she was hurt. The police had only said they were conducting an investigation. No one had confirmed that it was a homicide. Had Mark assumed it, or had he known all along? As detectives continued their inquiries, they turned to the people closest to Teresa, her family, her colleagues, her friends. They needed to understand who she was, who she trusted, and more importantly, who might have had a reason to want her dead. Everyone they spoke to had the same things to say. Teresa was successful. She was well respected in her field. Teresa was dedicated to her work. She was known for helping women with hormone therapy, alternative medicine, and health treatments that weren't always embraced by traditional doctors. Teresa had enemies. Her work, while admired by many, had also made her a target. Some people disagreed with her medical practices. Others had financial disputes with her. And then there was her marriage. Several close friends revealed that Teresa and Mark's relationship had been strained in recent months. They had argued about money, about their business, about trust. One friend even claimed that Teresa had been worried about something, that she had confided in them about a feeling she couldn't shake. "She told me she was scared," the friend admitted. "She didn't know why. She just felt like something bad was going to happen." From the moment investigators stepped into the crime scene, it was clear that this was not a random act of violence. The sheer brutality of the attack, the fact that there were no signs of forced entry, and the calculated nature of the assault all pointed to something personal. Someone had wanted Dr. Teresa Sievers dead, and they had made sure to leave no room for survival. Detectives began their work by considering the most common motives for homicide: jealousy, revenge, financial gain, or personal betrayal. In most cases, the answer was found by looking at those closest to the victim. That meant starting with her husband, Mark Sievers. Mark had been out of town during the murder, still in Connecticut with his daughters. His alibi was solid, supported by flight records, receipts, and multiple witnesses. But an alibi alone wasn't enough to rule him out. Investigators had learned that emotions, or the lack thereof, often revealed more than alibis ever could. And something about Mark's reaction felt off. His phone call with detectives had been emotional, filled with sobs and gasps, but there was a hollowness to it, a sense that it wasn't entirely genuine. It wasn't just grief, it was performance. And then there was the moment that sent a ripple of suspicion through the entire investigation. Before detectives had given him any details, before they had told him how Teresa had died, Mark had immediately assumed she had been murdered. No one had said the word murder to him yet. No one had confirmed that she was dead. But Mark had jumped straight to it. It could have been a natural assumption, a husband fearing the worst. But to investigators, it felt like something else. A slip. A moment where he had spoken faster than his mind could catch up. A man who had just lost his wife should have been asking, "What happened?" Instead, Mark had already seemed to know. As detectives dug deeper, they found another reason to keep Mark at the center of their investigation. On the surface, the Sievers family seemed financially stable, but in reality they were struggling. The medical practice was in debt. Their personal expenses were mounting. And then a crucial piece of information surfaced. Teresa Sievers had a life insurance policy worth $4.4 million. Mark was the sole beneficiary. It was the kind of detail that couldn't be ignored. Money was often the most powerful motive of all. Still, there was no proof linking Mark directly to the crime. He had been in another state. If he was involved, he hadn't done it himself. Someone else had carried out the murder. But who? Investigators expanded their scope, looking at other possible threats in Teresa's life. Through interviews with colleagues and close friends, they learned that while Teresa was beloved by many, she had also made enemies. Her alternative approach to medicine, particularly in hormone therapy and holistic healing, had been controversial. Some doctors viewed her as innovative, while others saw her as reckless. Patients either swore by her methods or felt she had misled them. Months before her death, Teresa had received threatening emails from a former patient who claimed her treatment had harmed him. In one message, he had written that she had ruined his life and would pay for it. But when detectives tracked him down, he had an airtight alibi. There were no signs of violent intent in his history. Frustration and anger, yes, but not the kind of cold-blooded rage that had been unleashed on Teresa. The crime didn't fit the profile of an enraged patient. It was too brutal, too precise. This wasn't an act of revenge, it was an execution. Then came an unsettling report. A neighbor had mentioned seeing a strange vehicle parked near the Sievers' home on the night of the murder. It wasn't a car that belonged to Teresa or Mark, and it wasn't a vehicle they recognized. Surveillance footage from a nearby street camera confirmed the sighting. A car entering the neighborhood late at night, but never leaving. That meant one of two things. Either the driver had parked elsewhere, or they were still inside when the murder happened. Detectives were combing through possible leads when something unexpected happened. A tip came in from a police department in Missouri, hundreds of miles away. A man named Curtis Wayne Wright had been overheard making comments about a crime he had been involved in. The details were vague, but there was one fact investigators couldn't ignore. Curtis was Mark Sievers' best friend. They had known each other since high school. Wright had a history of petty crime, drug charges, theft, a few instances of violence, but nothing that suggested he was capable of murder, at least not on his own. The Missouri police had no solid evidence linking Wright to Teresa's death, but the fact that he was talking about it at all was enough to make investigators stop in their tracks. Why would Mark Sievers' best friend be discussing a murder that had happened states away? If Wright was involved, he hadn't done it alone. And if he was talking, it was only a matter of time before the whole conspiracy unraveled. The deeper investigators dug, the more tangled the case became. The murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers was beginning to look less like a crime of passion and more like a carefully orchestrated plan, one that suggested more than one person had been involved. At first glance, the crime scene appeared deliberate, but certain details felt inconsistent. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, yet nothing indicated that Teresa had been expecting company that night. There was no evidence of her opening the door for someone or making plans to meet anyone after arriving home. Had someone been waiting for her, or had they used a key? The security system, which had been manually deactivated, was another troubling factor. The Sievers family had cameras installed, yet they were turned off at the exact window of time when Teresa had been killed. There was no sign of tampering, no forced shutdown. Someone had access. Detectives returned to the timeline. Teresa had landed in Florida late Sunday evening, driving straight home from the airport. She had sent a couple of messages after arriving. Nothing unusual. And then, silence. Sometime between her arrival and the early morning hours, she had been brutally murdered. As forensic teams processed the evidence, they found something strange. Blood splatter told them Teresa had been attacked in the kitchen, likely ambushed the moment she entered. But there were no signs of a struggle anywhere else in the house. No attempt to flee, no defensive wounds that suggested she had tried to fight back for long. It was as if the killer had struck so swiftly and forcefully that Teresa had no time to react. Yet there was another detail that made investigators pause. In high-profile, targeted murders, a common pattern often emerged: the presence of overkill. Victims were often shot, stabbed, or bludgeoned multiple times, even after they were already incapacitated. It was a psychological marker, a sign that the murder wasn't just about eliminating the victim, but about sending a message. And Teresa's injuries showed just that. 17 blows. A single strike could have been fatal, yet the killer hadn't stopped. The weapon, a hammer, had been wielded with methodical, unrelenting force. This wasn't the kind of violence seen in burglaries gone wrong. This was something else. Detectives turned their attention to the mysterious vehicle caught on surveillance footage. The footage wasn't perfectly clear, but the vehicle had been identified as a rental car. It had entered the neighborhood shortly before midnight, but there was no record of it leaving. Investigators traced the car back to a rental company out of state, leading them to Missouri, the same state where Curtis Wayne Wright, Mark Sievers' longtime friend, had been living. At first, the connection seemed too vague to be conclusive. The car rental could have been coincidental, an unrelated traveler passing through the area. But something about it felt too convenient, especially given that detectives had just received a tip about Wright making cryptic comments about a murder. The forensic team then discovered something even more alarming. Inside Teresa's home, on a surface near the crime scene, a small trace of DNA had been found. It didn't belong to Teresa, nor did it match anyone in the immediate family. It belonged to an unidentified male. The DNA was entered into the national database. If this was a known criminal, someone with a record, investigators could have a breakthrough within days. But before they could even process those results, another troubling lead emerged. When detectives interviewed Teresa's close friends, several of them recounted something unsettling. In the weeks leading up to her murder, Teresa had been feeling uneasy. She hadn't outright stated that she feared for her life, but she had mentioned a growing sense of anxiety, as though something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what. One friend recalled Teresa making a chilling remark: "If anything happens to me, look at Mark." It had been said casually, almost as a joke, but now in the context of her brutal murder, those words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. But suspicion alone wasn't enough to make an arrest. Mark Sievers had a strong alibi. He was hundreds of miles away at the time of the murder, surrounded by witnesses. If he was involved, then he hadn't acted alone, and that meant there was someone out there who had carried out this crime on his behalf. Meanwhile, the search for the unidentified male DNA continued. Detectives cross-checked it against the Missouri connection. Curtis Wayne Wright had a criminal record. If he was involved, there was a chance his DNA would be in the system. Within days, the results came back. The DNA at the crime scene was not Curtis Wayne Wright's, but it was linked to someone he knew. Investigators had uncovered a second suspect, a man named Jimmy Ray Rogers. Rogers was a known associate of Wright with a history of violent crime. He had been arrested in the past for weapons charges, assault, and burglary. He was the kind of man who knew how to hurt people and didn't need much of a reason to do it. His name wasn't linked to Teresa Sievers in any way. There was no record of them ever meeting, no connection between them. But the DNA evidence placed him inside her home on the night she was killed. That meant one thing. This wasn't just a murder, it was a murder for hire. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. What had started as a single brutal murder was now unraveling into something far more complex. Teresa Sievers had not been the victim of a random attack or a crime of passion. This was a hit, carefully planned and ruthlessly executed. For weeks, detectives had been methodically piecing together the fragments of the case. The absence of forced entry, the deactivated security system, and the calculated nature of the attack all pointed toward one undeniable fact. The killer had access to Teresa's life. With the discovery of DNA evidence linking Jimmy Ray Rogers to the crime scene, investigators were now dealing with a second suspect, someone with no known connection to Teresa herself. Rogers was not a jilted lover, a disgruntled patient, or an angry business associate. He was, by all accounts, a hired gun, a man brought in for a job. The key question now was, who had sent him? Detectives turned their full attention to Curtis Wainwright. The Missouri tip had already suggested his involvement, and the evidence was mounting. Wright and Mark Sievers had been close friends since high school. Their connection was strong, long-standing, and built on decades of trust. Investigators began digging into Wright's background. He had a criminal record, though nothing as serious as murder. Small-time fraud, drug offenses, minor theft charges. He was someone who operated in the shadows, but nothing about him immediately screamed killer. However, what did stand out was his recent financial activity. Wright had been making unusually large cash transactions in the weeks leading up to Teresa's murder. He had taken time off from work, traveled unexpectedly, and had multiple unaccounted-for expenses. Then there was his connection to Jimmy Ray Rogers. Rogers wasn't just a random name in the system. He was a known associate of Wright, someone with a history of violence, someone who could be counted on to carry out a job without asking too many questions. As investigators pressed further, they uncovered phone records between Wright and Mark Sievers. The frequency of communication had spiked dramatically in the days before the murder. And then, on the night before Teresa was killed, there was a crucial call, one that lasted longer than any of the others. The timing was too coincidental. Investigators knew what this meant. They were no longer looking at a single, isolated killer. They were looking at a murder-for-hire plot. In law enforcement, proving a conspiracy is far more challenging than catching an individual suspect. Intent is harder to establish, direct evidence is rare, and the masterminds often cover their tracks well. But in this case, mistakes had been made. The rental car that had been spotted near Teresa's home on the night of the murder was traced back to Wright. It had been rented under a different name, but forensic teams found his fingerprints inside. Then came the most damning piece of evidence yet: cell phone data. Forensic analysts pinged Wright's and Rogers' phones, tracking their movements leading up to the murder. Their phones had traveled from Missouri to Florida together, moving in sync. They had arrived in Florida just in time for Teresa's murder. And then, right after the crime, they had disappeared, heading straight back to Missouri. The pattern was undeniable. Investigators had the physical evidence, they had the financial transactions, they had the cell phone data. Now they needed a confession. The first to crack was Jimmy Ray Rogers. Rogers had a reputation for toughness, but when faced with the overwhelming evidence, his bravado began to fade. He knew the weight of the case against him. He had left behind DNA. His phone had been tracked. The murder weapon, a hammer, had been found with traces of his fingerprints. There was no way out, so he made a choice. Rather than take the fall alone, he started talking. He admitted that Curtis Wainwright had brought him in on the job. Wright had promised it would be easy, in and out, a quick kill, and a guaranteed payday. And Wright, he had been hired by Mark Sievers. The entire plan, from the very beginning, had been orchestrated by Mark. The money troubles, the strain in the marriage, the looming threat of a divorce. Mark Sievers had seen only one way out. He would never have custody of his children if Teresa left him. He would be financially ruined. But if she was gone, he would collect millions from her life insurance. So he turned to the one man he trusted most, Curtis Wainwright. And Wright, in turn, had hired Rogers to finish the job. As detectives processed the full scope of the conspiracy, the reality of the crime became even more chilling. Teresa had been living under the same roof as a man who had plotted her death. She had trusted him. She had built a life with him. And in the end, he had handed that life over to killers for a payout. The Sievers case had shifted from a brutal homicide to a premeditated murder-for-hire plot, one that was now fully exposed. Investigators had spent weeks dissecting each layer, following the breadcrumbs from the crime scene to the people behind it. Now they had what they needed, a connection between Mark Sievers, Curtis Wainwright, and Jimmy Ray Rogers. The pieces of the puzzle had finally formed a complete picture. Rogers' DNA at the crime scene placed him inside Teresa's home at the time of the murder. Cell phone data confirmed both Rogers and Wright had traveled from Missouri to Florida together. The rental car was linked to Wright, proving he had been in the area. Rogers had confessed, pointing directly at Wright, and ultimately at Mark Sievers. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was a cold-blooded assassination designed to look like a random attack. But in their attempt to erase their tracks, the killers had made critical mistakes. Detectives now had a choice in how to proceed. The evidence against Rogers was overwhelming, but the bigger target was Mark Sievers. Without his involvement, the murder wouldn't have happened. But getting a conviction on a man who hadn't physically committed the crime was far more difficult. The strategy was clear. Curtis Wainwright needed to flip. He was the bridge between Mark Sievers and Jimmy Ray Rogers. If Wright cooperated, he could provide the final nail in Mark's coffin. Wright, however, wasn't easy to break. Unlike Rogers, he wasn't a man who folded under pressure. He had been careful. He had covered his tracks as best he could, but even he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence against him. Rogers had already turned on him. The rental car data, the phone records, the financial trail, it was undeniable. Wright was trapped. He could either take a full sentence for murder or cooperate in exchange for a lesser charge. The choice was obvious. Wright made a deal. His confession solidified everything detectives had suspected. Wright confirmed that Mark Sievers had orchestrated the murder. Mark had reached out to him months before Teresa's death, complaining about their failing marriage, their financial troubles, and the looming possibility that Teresa would divorce him. If that happened, Mark feared he would lose everything: his daughters, his business, his lifestyle. But there was a way out. If Teresa was gone, Mark would collect over $4 million from her life insurance. It had started as a conversation, Mark venting his frustrations, dropping hints that his life would be better if Teresa wasn't in it. But soon it became a plan. Wright, desperate for money and still holding on to his loyalty to his old friend, agreed to help. Wright, however, wasn't willing to carry out the murder himself. That's when Jimmy Ray Rogers entered the picture. Rogers, a known criminal with a violent past, was willing to do the job, for a price. Wright set it up, arranging for the two of them to travel to Florida under the guise of a road trip. But in reality, their destination was Teresa's home, and their objective was to kill her. On the night of the murder, Rogers and Wright entered the house easily. They had a key. Mark Sievers had given it to them. There was no struggle, no warning. Teresa had walked into her home that night, unaware that two men were already inside waiting for her. The attack was swift, merciless, and violent. 17 blows with a hammer. Then they wiped down the scene, turned off the security system, and left. The plan had been simple, but Mark had underestimated one thing. He had assumed that because he wasn't there, he couldn't be tied to the crime. He had assumed that Wright and Rogers would never talk. He had assumed they wouldn't make mistakes. With Wright's confession, detectives had everything they needed. Mark Sievers had thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime, but he had left behind too many loose ends. His sudden spike in communication with Wright before the murder raised suspicion. His life insurance policy on Teresa was too large to ignore. His own wife had predicted her fate, telling friends that if anything happened, they should look at him. And most damning of all, his closest friend had just testified against him. The betrayal was complete. Mark Sievers was arrested. The man who had played the grieving husband, who had attended his wife's funeral in tears, was now in handcuffs, accused of orchestrating her murder. The case that had begun with a single act of unimaginable violence had now unveiled a tangled web of greed, betrayal, and deception. And for Mark Sievers, the reckoning was just beginning. With Mark Sievers in custody, the case that had begun with a single brutal murder was now heading toward the courtroom. It was no longer just a homicide investigation. It was a legal battle to prove that a husband had orchestrated the murder of his own wife. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence. They had the confessions from both Jimmy Ray Rogers and Curtis Wainwright, phone records that detailed weeks of planning, and financial documents that laid out the undeniable motive. But despite the overwhelming case against him, Mark Sievers pleaded not guilty. The trial was set to be one of the most high-profile murder cases in Florida's history. A respected doctor had been brutally killed. Her husband was accused of masterminding the crime, and the entire case had unfolded like something out of a crime novel, except this was real. Prosecutors wasted no time in presenting their case. The first key witness was Curtis Wainwright. His plea deal had been secured in exchange for full cooperation. On the stand, he recounted every detail of the murder plot, from the first conversations with Mark Sievers to the moment he and Rogers walked into Teresa's home with a hammer in hand. Wright admitted that Mark had given them a key, ensuring that they could get inside without a struggle. He confirmed that Mark had offered him money in exchange for carrying out the murder, promising him a cut from the life insurance payout. The jury listened as Wright described how he and Rogers had driven to Florida, how they had entered the Sievers' home late at night, and how Teresa had never even seen them coming. The courtroom was silent as he described the attack, how the first blow had come so suddenly that she barely had time to react, how the hammer had fallen again and again until there was no life left in her. Rogers had already been convicted of his role in the crime, and his confession had sealed the prosecution's case. But the most critical moment of the trial wasn't just the testimony, it was the hard evidence. The prosecution laid it all out. Cell phone records placed Mark Sievers in constant contact with Wright in the days leading up to the murder. Financial records showed that Mark was deeply in debt and stood to gain millions from Teresa's death. Forensic analysis confirmed that Rogers had been in the home, that his DNA had been found near the crime scene. Surveillance footage caught the rental car near the Sievers' residence the night of the murder, a car linked directly to Wright and Rogers. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same story. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a planned assassination carried out by killers hired by a desperate man. The defense had little room to maneuver. They tried to discredit Wright, arguing that he was only testifying to save himself, that his plea deal gave him a reason to lie. They attempted to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting that there were gaps in the state's case. But none of it was enough. Too many facts lined up. Too many details matched Wright's account. Too many pieces of the puzzle fit together in a way that couldn't be ignored. Then came the most damning moment. The prosecution played a jailhouse recording of Mark Sievers. In the recording, made during a phone call with a family member, Sievers never directly admitted to the crime, but his words were enough to betray him. He spoke about being framed, about how no one could really prove he had done anything, about how the police were twisting the truth. It wasn't the statement of an innocent man. It was the statement of someone trying to convince himself that he could still get away with it. The trial lasted weeks, but the jury needed only 4 hours to reach a verdict. Mark Sievers was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentencing phase would be next. The question was no longer whether Mark Sievers was guilty, it was whether he would live or die for what he had done. With Mark Sievers convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, the case entered its final stage. The courtroom, once filled with forensic experts, detectives, and witnesses, now turned its attention to one final question. Would Mark Sievers be sentenced to life in prison, or would he face the death penalty? The state of Florida had a strong history of pursuing the death sentence for premeditated murders, particularly those committed for financial gain. The prosecution argued that Teresa Sievers' murder wasn't just brutal, it was calculated, merciless, and motivated by pure greed. Mark Sievers had plotted her death for months. He had manipulated those closest to him, and when the time came, he showed no remorse. The state presented the aggravating factors. The murder was cold and premeditated. Mark had orchestrated the entire plan, hiring Wright and Rogers to carry out the attack, while he maintained an airtight alibi. It was a crime of greed. Mark had been drowning in debt, and Teresa's life insurance was his way out. He saw his wife's life as a financial asset, something to be eliminated when it no longer benefited him. It was a betrayal of trust. Teresa had welcomed him into her life, built a family with him, and supported him. In return, he had sent killers to her home, giving them the key to ensure she couldn't escape. Mark's defense team argued that a life sentence would be more appropriate, pointing out that he had not physically committed the murder himself. But the jury had little sympathy for him. He may not have wielded the hammer, but he had placed it in the hands of those who did. When the jury returned, the verdict was clear. Mark Sievers was sentenced to death. In Florida, death row inmates spend years in appeals, and Mark Sievers would have every opportunity to fight the sentence. But for Teresa's family, for those who had loved her, this was the justice they had waited for. The case that had shaken the quiet community of Bonita Springs had finally come to an end. With Mark Sievers sentenced, the other two men involved in the crime also faced their own fates. Curtis Wayne Wright, the middleman in the murder plot, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. His plea deal had saved him from the death penalty, but he would spend the next 2 decades behind bars, knowing that he had destroyed a family for a payout that never even materialized. Jimmy Ray Rogers, the man who had carried out the murder, was sentenced to life in prison. There would be no parole, no second chance. For Teresa's daughters, the loss was immeasurable. They had not only lost their mother in the most horrific way possible, but their father was now a convicted murderer, a man who had planned the death of the very woman who had brought them into the world. The question remained, why? Why had Mark Sievers believed he could get away with this? Why had he thought that money could replace the mother of his children? Why had he gambled with lives as if they were nothing more than numbers in a bank account? In the end, he had lost everything. The murder of Teresa Sievers became one of the most infamous homicide cases in Florida history. It was a textbook case of greed, deception, and betrayal, a crime that proved that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers, but those we trust the most. It had begun with a wife returning home after a family vacation, unaware that her own husband had sent killers to wait for her. It had ended with a guilty verdict, a death sentence, and the destruction of a family. Justice had been served, but no sentence, not life in prison, not even the death penalty, could undo what had happened. Teresa Sievers was gone, and the people who had conspired to take her life would spend the rest of theirs paying the price. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.